Okay, this last video on, or not, video presentation on this issue of sort of identity, is going to just sort of, it's going to be short because some of this is sort of reiterating stuff I've already gone over. This is a part of what my research is, though it's sort of postponed now by the Palolo project. But in many cases, this is not an area that anthropologists have gotten into in a big way. And I think you have to remember, like most behavioral sciences, it's much easier to do what you've been trained to do in the way that you were trained to do it. And you have to remember, most anthropologists or anthropologists now went through programs and learned how to do their work, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, or even, 2000s. And in that context, ironically, while they were using digital social media a lot, certainly email and even, social media like, say, Instagram, it was something that they used, but it wasn't really an area of research. Anthropologists were involved in sort of two things. I think I mentioned this at the very beginning of the semester. One was the traditional logic of anthropology is that you're translating cultures or groups to outsiders, so that you're making sense of a group for folks that aren't part of that group, so that you get more understanding between people about differences and the relevant and how people relate. Another part of anthropology, which became a big thing from the 1990s on, in part due to this whole sort of move of critiquing existing intellectual traditions, was the idea that anthropology had been a colonial discipline, that anthropology had taken advantage of people, that anthropology served no function other than self-serving, in the sense that anthropologists were only doing it because they wanted to get promoted, get jobs, etc. So that really sort of negative spin, then was sort of like anthropologists that were around in anthropology in the 90s, they owed all the groups that they had studied or had, quote, taken advantage of by studying earlier. And also to a certain extent, we're supposed to do payback for anthropologists that had done work, say, in the 30s or 40s. So it's sort of like this, for lack of a better term, I'm just going to call it the guilt trip, that basically anthropology had to apologize for its past by not only changing what it looked at in the present, but also actually reaching out and trying to repair the damage that had been done in the past, which is all good and fine. But of course, if you know anything about people, you realize that the past is the past. You can modify it, but the modifications are occurring in the now, not in the then. And in many cases, we're talking about colonial situations that don't exist anymore. So, if you're a British anthropologist, how do you repair if you're studying folks in, say, northern India, say Punjab, what do you do that repairs the damage of the British colonial system in the 19th and 20th centuries? Well, not a hell of a lot. So, how do you atone for the sins of your forebears, if you want to think of it that way? And this sort of, intellectual circular logic just became a huge part of anthropology, right down till now. So what you find is what I'd call sort of anthropology activism, which is that anthropologists, their job is actually to be a spokesperson for groups that aren't getting listened to. Now, of course, there's a huge problem with that, because, if you're one of those groups, then you on one hand, you might like the idea that you've got some sort of Western intellectual who's sort of sponsoring or helping you guys out. On the other hand, that, of course, is also intellectual colonialism. So in many cases, when you're doing this, you could put a spin on it and basically say, well, you're just another version of, Evans Pritchard studying in Africa in the 1920s and taking advantage of people. Not intentionally, but by virtue of the fact that he's white and he can study them and there's not much they can do about it. You're doing the same thing if you're helping some group out now, because you're sort of making the assumption they can't do it on their own. So, that whole area of activism anthropology has, to be honest, at least in my view, has gotten out of hand. You find there's a whole chunk of anthropologists that are heavily involved in espousing social causes, and they identify themselves as anthropologists. But in many ways, if the purpose of anthropology is to translate and explain one group to another group, at some point, if the activism becomes sort of what you might call a attack approach, I'm not sure how much explaining you're trying to do. If you're yelling at people, you're not really explaining, you're just sort of lecturing them. So, that form of anthropology is on one hand, it's very easy to do. It's very easy to, as you guys well know, it's very easy to get emotionally and socially involved in something and then become an activist in a particular cause, and you believe in the cause, et cetera, et cetera. But at that point, I don't really understand what anthropological training has to do with it. And therefore, if you think about what you guys learned this semester has to do with it, that's just a personal whatever. So between those two tracks of doing traditional anthropology, studying the changing political, kinship realities of populations living in eastern, northeastern Afghanistan under the Taliban, for example, or activist approach, trying to make changes in feminist attitudes in Thailand by virtue of the male-dominated government. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not sure exactly how an anthropologist contributes in any unique way to that, but whatever. So those are sort of the two branches. What gets sort of ironically lost in all that is one of the massive areas of social change, both individually, group, and in sort of the human collective, has been this whole issue of the digital, which we've been looking at sort of off and on since the start of the semester, certainly right now especially. And you don't find many anthropologists getting into it. In fact, there's a whole growing body of literature from folks that do these type of studies on how you actually look at the digital, and whether you can actually use traditional anthropological techniques or if you have to use something different. Some folks make it sound like it's totally different, and I've got 3 or 4, books on digital anthropology as if it's an entirely different discipline almost. Other folks like Miller's group don't see that at all, and nor does Bullersdorf with his study in Second Life. He doesn't see the folks in Second Life and the social communities they have there as being any different as a real world community. He's got some really great videos discussing the fact that Second Life is just another version of community. It doesn't make any difference whether it's digital or it has avatars or if it's real. It's just community is community. And Miller would totally agree. And there's a bunch of good videos by him. Let me just pull up their website so you can actually see it here. And I strongly suggest you spend some time on this. It's absolutely fascinating. Superb short videos, great research, in a very modern, what I consider the way you're supposed to do anthropology. All their research findings are actually available for free from the website, so you can actually look at the research results that they've got, and they're constantly posting more stuff. In terms of a general analysis of the impacts of social media, again, done in very short, very consumable videos. Here's some of the research findings in larger course. Notice the fact that you can actually consume this in different languages. So it's designed to be accessible, among other things, to the very populations they studied in. In my personal view, this is what anthropology should be. And especially now, it sort of has to be if it's going to be relevant. But the key thing here is what they're looking at, of course, is social media. And large part, I was doing work when these guys were, so I didn't realize they were doing work till we were already doing ours. But in many ways, this is an example of what good anthropology is in 2020. They're still doing some of the work. I think the programs now shifted to this issue of social media and aging, which is, I think, Miller's current interest. So I think he's doing more research in England. I can't remember where else. So it's sort of shifting as they move along, which again is typical of good anthropology. As you do studies, you start to realize you've got new questions. In the process of getting answers, you build new questions, and then if you're a good anthropologist, you follow those new questions and see where that leads you. It never ends per se. It just at some point you either collapse from exhaustion or else you go off on another tangent. But still, there's this point of trying to understand and explain to everyone, or at least to chunks of people, just exactly what's going on. And I would strongly suggest this is if you want to think of what anthropology is and should be in the future, the University College London is a good example of how that works out. So in that context, I would really highly recommend. Here's the link. I'll put it in an address and thing. So in that context, this is to a certain extent sort of finishing up on this idea of what digital realities are. At least for an anthropologist, I think Miller's work is probably a real good summation of the work to date. That these are global phenomena. They don't necessarily change groups, because it's important to remember these are all technology. In the same way that phones, radio, TVs, cable TV, all this stuff were technologies. People modify the technologies into whatever they think they need. And that's a major part of the work that they did in their social media examinations. It's just because everyone's using Facebook doesn't mean that Facebook's used the same way or for the same purposes from one society to the next. And especially the study they did comparing Chile and Brazil is absolutely fascinating. Two cultures that are basically physically quite close to each other that have entirely different ways of the way they interact on social media. So what happens is in many cases, though, we see social media as being a push force. In many cases, as he points out, it's merely a technological way to amplify what the group already is. So rather than changing group dynamics, maybe in some ways what it does is it amplifies group dynamics. Now, and of course, in doing that, it does change the relationship of some stuff, but it doesn't necessarily make a new thing. It just makes a modified form. And so when you're looking at this, of course, there's other aspects that spin into this. We've already talked about the issue of social worlds. Again, as I mentioned before, Facebook has spent $1 gazillion on trying to develop a virtual reality world for Facebook, with the idea that if Facebook is gonna survive 20 years from now, it can't be based on the technology it is now. It has to be based where people can basically spend hours, if not days, in a Facebook world where they interact with others. So sort of taking the Second Life model and sort of extrapolating that to roughly a quarter of the world's population, which I think is the total on Facebook right now. As technology changes, maybe that's going to change the idea of virtual reality, or what we now think is more likely, what we call augmented reality. Feel free to Google that if you want more explanations on it. Are again part of the way that we're reintegrating or changing the way that we integrate with the world, but it's not necessarily changing all of social dynamics. It's just changing some of the interrelationship of social dynamics, maybe. And a good example of that would be when you think like things like retailing. And of course, this panel was all done pre-COVID. So in the COVID world we exist now in late 2020, you're seeing a lot of this. The current discussion as I'm doing this talk about how people are going to handle Thanksgiving. Do you combine Zoom/Skype and people around the table? Do you really change the social dynamics? You just change how you do the social dynamics. And for example, if you're buying stuff, how do you do that? Is it really totally different, or is it just a different version of the same thing? And you see this a lot of some of the companies I'm involved with, for example, that now find themselves having to deal with Yelp, which they didn't have to, say, 5 years ago, where all of a sudden now they've got to deal with people either complimenting or dissing them on their performance, and yet they can't figure out if those people actually consume their product. Is this someone who actually went to a travel site and tried to use a travel agency, for example, or is this just someone who decided to crap on a travel agency because it's Tuesday? And so writes a nasty review that's not based in fact. Well, to the agency, it doesn't make any difference whether it's a real review or a fake review. It's almost impossible to get taken off of Yelp. So if you get enough of the fake reviews, all of a sudden you can find your image among your actual consumer population starts to drop based on entirely artificial constructs. Now that happened in the past. People would gossip about a company. Excuse me. But in the past, it was on a much smaller scale. Now on Yelp, it's up there, and basically anyone can look at it at any time. So does it really completely change stuff, or is it just partially change stuff? And we looked at, for example, catfishing. It's estimated now that roughly, I think the last number I saw was 38% or 42%, I forget exactly what, of relationships started online. I suspect the number is actually substantially higher, but people don't want to admit it. In some societies, it's hugely higher, and others not near as much. So does that actually change the way that people interact? Or does it just change the process by how those interactions, move through a sequence? We don't know. I'm asking you questions, but I'm giving you no answers. That's because we don't know. And that's what Miller's trying to get at. In some cases, we don't really understand what the impact of all this digital stuff is. COVID has accelerated this, but these changes were occurring anyways. A quarter of the world's population was already on Facebook prior to COVID ever showing up. Are they using Facebook more? Oh, undoubtedly. Is it more important to them socially? Yeah, for a lot of people it probably is, but it isn't like it showed up out of nowhere. And so this is true of a lot of this issue of the digital. This is the year we're in 2020. Is probably, fast forward us maybe 2 or 3 years into what would have been otherwise maybe 2022 is now occurring in late 2020. What's that going to mean in 2021? I don't know. We can make some guesses from the standpoint of anthropology and the way that we deal with social media. But if Miller's studies are anywhere close, what he points out is basically social media, for example, doesn't make or break a family. Social media might speed up or amplify relationships or the collapse of relationships, but his argument is in many cases it would have occurred anyways, or something else would have resulted in sort of the same phenomena. And that sort of fits what Bullersdorf was talking about that I think I mentioned last time, or maybe 2 times ago, is the fact that the work in Second Life, which I think is becoming more and more relevant simply because it now has about 10 years of age in it. Um, and the work was done back in 07, 08, 09. So it's now been around for about 10 or 11 years, is the realization that things like the speeding up of social relationships, the speeding up of a lot of these ideas of social integration, the ability to develop, very powerful emotional groups in very short periods of time, even though members are rotating in and out. All of this doesn't appear to be at all Second Life unique. It appears to be a reflection of what we're seeing in a larger scale with social media. Now, would those relationships have shown up in the same way? Maybe not. But people would be in relationships. Would that group have shown up? Oh, probably not, because they would have had a integration with people that are global, who could comfortably move in because they're avatars. They don't have to actually expose themselves and who they really are. But would they have been in groups anyways? Undoubtedly. So, sort of the main takeaway from a lot of this, at least for anthropologists like me that study this, is that the digital hasn't changed reality, but in many ways the digital has either made it more complex or it's sped it up. Miller actually brings this up in a couple of the studies they did, I think especially the Chinese one that people were pointing out, as in Second Life, that social relationships moved a lot quicker now, because you could constantly post, repost, react to posts, and et cetera, whereas before you might actually have to talk to someone. But they weren't really too sure it made for more or less of something that just sort of sped it up. And that in many ways is reflective of what we see in terms of personal relationships with social media and the level of stress that people are exhibiting in 2019, 2020, regardless of COVID, as the stress level from social media has just been skyrocketing. And that would make sense if what you're doing is you're accelerating relationships and accelerating how people identify themselves and the acceptance of identity. So what you could basically try to plan out over a year maybe happens in a couple of weeks now. And of course, that's going to have all sorts of psychological and social impacts. So that's where we sort of think the digital is. It's a very complex study or area of study. It's something that very few people are doing, sad to say. And it's at some point, the vast majority of folks that do work like sociologists and anthropologists are going to realize that this is a major area that has to be studied because it literally impacts. It's a global impact. But it also impacts groups and folks as individuals and groups and families, et cetera. It's not just a communications tool. It's turned out to a way to sort of amplify or at least accelerate maybe social relationships in general.